Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. My name is Betty and I'm the director of the Brisbane French Festival. I am really happy to see you. So Amanda just joined us. I am really happy today to be presenting the second last webinar for the day, because this is actually the best way to celebrate Bastille Day. And I have to say that I'm ready for this. So Amanda, we are ready for this.
Cheers, Betty. And just that we're very French and thinking the same thing. I'm drinking the same bottle as you without even talking about it.
We haven't even spoken about it, but I think we're both ready with the same bottle, so that's good. That's probably a good pick. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to wish you a happy Bastille Day. If we haven't seen each other today, it's been a busy day for us, but I think if there's only one way to celebrate Bastille Day is actually to talk about champagne. So a lot of you would be very familiar with Amanda. Amanda has been a friend of the Brisbane French Festival pretty much since its creation. She has been running presentations on stage, sabering demonstrations and masterclasses. But today, this cultural webinar is more about the culture around champagne. So what is champagne? Is it different to bubbles? What makes a champagne what it actually is? So Amanda, as you probably know, is an independent champagne ambassador. She is the creator of the Effervescence Festival. It is the first festival entirely dedicated to champagne. So we are very lucky that this is happening in Brisbane every year. Amanda is also organizing lunches and dinners to represent different brands of champagne, to make you discover these different cuvées that she represents. And also Amanda has been, I've got this here, in 2014, Amanda, and that's really impressive, was the finalist in the professional division of the prestigious Vin de Champagne Awards. So this is a big recognition, and that means she knows a lot about champagne. So I probably will stop talking. I will probably grab my glass of champagne and let you run through everything we need to know. It's called Champagne 101, but I'm sure most of them will learn many things because we take for granted that people do know how it's made, where it's coming from, but I'm sure you will teach us a lot of things we don't know. So all yours, Amanda, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Betty, and happy Bastille Day to everyone as well. When Betty first flagged the idea of doing these cultural webinars with me during the French Festival and asked me what day I was available, I said, if I'm going to talk about champagne, we have to do it on Bastille Day. So, and we have to do it at the l'heure d'apéritif, so the time for our little drink, and have some champagne. So I hope a lot of people who are watching tonight have a lovely glass with them. And I do, so let's get started. Cheers. I always feel like I talk better about champagne when I have champagne in my hand, even though we're not really talking. So what I thought we would do tonight is give a little bit of a different, not so much a masterclass or a discussion about champagne the drink, but more about champagne, the region, and the history around it, because I think a lot of people, I get asked often about what's so different about champagne compared to sparkling wine, and why is it so much more expensive, and if it's made the same way, why isn't it the same drink? And I think there's various aspects involved in that, but a lot of it goes back to the history and the terroir and the place that champagne is made. So at the end, if there's any specific questions about making of champagne or anything else I touch on, I'm happy to ask them. But I just want to put something, I think people can come along to masterclasses and learn these things about how champagne's made or the differences with different champagnes. But what we don't often have time to talk about is these really interesting historical facts. So I'll just get started. I've got a series of slides. I'm going to switch back and forth just to try to illustrate some points, but I'm not a true academic or anything, so I'm not very good at doing PowerPoint things, but I would like to talk about a few things and get some points across. So firstly, I think everybody knows that Champagne is a little region in France. So it's a small region. It's about 34,000 hectares of growing area. That's 150 kilometers east of Paris. So I'll just show you, I've got that slide. There we go. And there was a tricky way we can find out. We can turn the whiteboard on. Now, I can draw on here. So this area, this is representing France, this little square down here, and the 2 red squares we have there are the Champagne region. And then, so you can see it's kind of the northeast of France, and it's quite north to be growing Champagne. So the top area is representing this area here, which has firstly the Montagne de Reims, which is this mountainous area around Reims. Then we have all along here is the Vallée de la Marne, which is historically very important because it's along the Marne Valley that leads through the river and is why Champagne was an important trade area. Down here we have the Côte de Blanc, which is important for its chalk, and it's a very important Chardonnay area. And then way down here, which is down here, the Orbe, this another area of Champagne that's actually closer to Burgundy. So it's the little red square down here that is representing the Orbe. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of those different regions as well. And it's all coming from Champagne, the way that the earth formed back in the Jurassic period, and the different levels of soils that settled there and gave this very different earth area. But going back to something more interesting, I think, is the fact that Champagne has really been an epicenter for a significant number of events for thousands of years. And so important is it for, there I am, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I knew I would do something wrong here. Okay, so all of this significant, the differences in the history, it means that in 2015, UNESCO actually gave Champagne World Heritage listing. And that means the hillsides, the houses, and the cellars were all World Heritage listed, recognising the exceptional universal value of the region. And that means they understood that all the work done to grow the grapes, to produce and distribute the Champagne wine, and all of this knowledge has been passed down for generations and generations. And it covers the whole 320 Champagne villages. So it's quite important. And that is one thing that I think is really important to remember, why Champagne is very different from other areas that are just trying to make sparkling wine the same way as Champagne. They don't have all of that knowledge. They don't have all of that history that's come down. So let's look back at a little bit of that history. I'm not sure who is a real history buff, but if we really, I'm going to have to go through very quickly each little area, because we're going to go right back to the Romans in 50 AD. So let's find that slide, just have a little look there. There we go. So in 50 AD, between 50 AD and 461 AD, the Romans ruled that area of Champagne. And there was actually the local tribe of Celts that lived in the region at the time were called the Remi. And the Remi, their capital was a place called Durocortorum, and that is what is now Reims. And at the time, Reims was a hub for travellers, both civilian and military travellers. And it's a lot to do with where it was situated in the crossing across Europe. So that was, it wasn't really a viticulture hub at the time, although they did grow grapes, and the Romans are responsible for starting mass plantings. But it didn't really become established until the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century AD. But what the Romans did do in Reims at the time was realise that it had this amazing wealth of chalk underground, and the chalk was quarried for buildings and construction. And what was interesting with the chalk for them was it was quite soft when it was wet underground, but when they mined it and brought it out, it became hard, and it was really good for building. So actually, if you visit Reims today, and you can see the walls of the city that are still there from Roman times. So they built 250 quarries in Champagne during the Roman rule, and these quarries, which were called crayères, the chalk mines, were later found by Claude Ruinart in the 1700s that they were perfect for storing champagne. So that's really interesting that way back in the 5th century, they started digging out quarries that got used hundreds of years later for Champagne, the region that became famous for it. So after, let me try and get my years together. So after the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages descended, and that's when the wars kind of really started in the area. There were wars in the region between the Franks, the Goths, the Burgunds, the Teutons, the Vandals, the Huns. There were just wars everywhere. And in the 5th century, the Franks, which were the Germans at the time, invaded Gaul, and their king was called Clovis. And he united all of the Gaul tribes, the French tribes at the time, and the church played a very, very big role in that. At the time, the spiritual leader of Reims was Bishop Remy, and Bishop Remy was intent on converting Clovis to Christianity. And so Clovis made a deal with him that if the Christian God allowed him victory in war, he'd convert to Christianity. So Bishop Remy blessed a cask of wine, and he told Clovis that as long as there was wine in the cask, Clovis would be victorious. And guess what? The cask never went dry. So Clovis believed in the Christian God, and he was baptized by Remy in Reims. And so also important to notice at that time, the wine wasn't sparkling, it was just still mainly red wine. And also at the time, the Benedictine monks had very large organizations, and grapes were very important as a communion wine for them. So the monks did look after the wine, and in fact, the cellar masters at the time had a big position of power and were held in very high regard. So then if we jump forward a few hundred years to 754, this is when Reims became important as a city for coronations for the kings of France. So what happened back then was the King Pepin the Short, which makes me laugh because it sounds like the grape seed is a pepper in French, and King Pepin the Short. He was the first king of the Frankish dynasty, and he was also the father of Charlemagne. And he had his second coronation in the Cathedral of Reims. I can't remember why. He had the first one, I think it was in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, where they still were crowning kings at the time. And for some reason, they had the second one back up in Reims. And from then on, for the next 600 years, all 27 kings from Louis VIII to Charles X in 1824 were crowned in the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Reims. So this is this beautiful building. I've got a slide of, I'll show you too, just get back. There we go. So it looks very much like Notre Dame de Paris. It's based on that. Even the back here, I was staying in Champagne last year at the same time that Notre Dame had the fire. And this, the photo on the right-hand side of your screen is very much like the view from my window. And I was watching Notre Dame de Paris burn as I was looking at this other one that looked identical out my window. It was quite eerie, really. So, yes, so anyway, we'll get back to the slides. So because of all of the kings being crowned, and it really set the page for Champagne to become a legend, that it was the wine of kings and the king of wines. So next we move on to the Middle Ages. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, vines were still just a small part of the region. Champagne was a centre of trade. And as I said earlier on, when we looked at the map of the region, we had the Marne River that ran up to Paris, and Paris being the capital, it was a good stop-off point for businesses. So there were spices, dyes, wool, leather. And when the business people came through the area at the time, they'd drink the wine of the region. So it was really only a secondary thing at that time for people to drink while they passed through. And from 1337 to 1443, we had the 100 Years' War. And that was a time that in the region, the church grew in power and wealth. The next sort of, the important part of 1429, something that we all know a little bit about, I think through school history, is Joan of Arc. So Joan of Arc's father was from Champagne. And I don't know if that's what really led her to want to liberate France, but, you know, 18 years old, there's some very historic photos, very iconic, not photos, I'm sorry, statues and paintings of her leading King Charles. She's liberated Reims in the cathedral in 1429, and she rode through the streets of Reims, leading King Charles VII to his coronation in the cathedral. So where's that photo of the cathedral? I get the chills when I go into France, to Reims, and you just think she drove up, the photo on the left, in a horse leading the king, 18-year-old girl on the back of the horse. It's fascinating that she could do that. And we've got, this is also a very famous painting of her at the crowning, this Joan of Arc holding the flag, and Charles VII. And just on a side note, Charles VII has a connection also with the Canard de Chêne, which is one of the sponsors of Le Festival. Canard de Chêne's Prestige champagne is named in Charles VII's honour, because they can trace their family history back to Charles VII, which for them is very significant. Okay. So after that, during the 1400s, in the middle, there were about 400 communes at that time that grew champagne. So it was starting to become more drunk because of, you know, just because of the trade and everything. And also during the Middle Ages, that was the time that the winemakers started noticing that in spring, the wines in the cask had a slight effervescence quality. And they took them a while to work it out, but they started to realize that winter and the colder weather interrupted the fermentation in the barrels. And so it just stopped. The fermentation just went to sleep in the colder months. And then in the springtime, when it warmed up again, the yeast came back to life, and that created these little small bubbles in the casks, but it dispersed. It didn't stay there. They didn't have a way of capturing it, and it was seen as a fault at the time. It wasn't really something that they were trying to replicate. So having said that, talking about bubbles, I think we can jump ahead now to the 1600s and talk a little bit about Dom Pérignon. So I have a picture. I think we've all seen. There we go. Old Dom Pérignon. So Dom Pérignon was, he's often credited with having invented champagne. He didn't invent champagne. He had a lot to do with improving the way it was made. So he was born in 1638 or 1639. They're not too sure about that. And he was a cellar master at the Abbey of Auvillers. And Auvillers is this beautiful village outside of Épernay. As you come down the mountain from the Montagne de Reims towards Épernay, and you can see it in the hillsides. It's absolutely beautiful, still very picturesque. And I think you can imagine it looks much the same way these days with the buildings as it did back then. So, Dom Pérignon, being the cellar master of the Auvillers Abbey, meant that he had a very important job. He was very highly regarded. And at the time, most of the wine was still red wine. So they weren't trying to make the bubbles in it. But what Dom Pérignon did was he decided to make white wine from black grapes. So we've spoken, anybody who's done some champagne masterclasses before will know that there's three main grapes nowadays that we use to make champagne. There's Chardonnay, which is clearly a white grape, but Pinot Noir and Meunier are both black skin grapes, but they have white flesh. So back in the 1600s, when they were pressing it all, they didn't pay a lot of attention to how they pressed it. They were just maybe a little bit rough with it, and they left the skin contacting the juice, and so the wine became red. But Dom Pérignon decided if he was really careful pressing the grapes very, very gently and removing the skins, he would get a white wine from those black grapes. And at the time, they started planting Pinot Noirs back in the 1500s, and it was still the most dominant grape at the time. So Dom Pérignon did realize that there was some advancements that could be made with that. He also realized that in the process of pressing, because they'd press, the weight of the press would let the initial juice run off, which he realized tasted better than subsequent pressings that had more contact with seeds and skins and things. So he knew that you could separate and make a better wine depending on the press that you used. He also was responsible for the first type of blending. He blended grapes from different vineyards and different types of grapes, and he did select what they called selective harvesting. So they'd go several passes through the fields to take the best, most ripest grapes to press and wait a few more days until other grapes were ripe. So there's quite a few different things like that that did mean that champagne became a better drink than it had been before he started doing those things. But they still had a few things that he couldn't do. He couldn't work out how he could capture that effervescence and make it stay in the bubbles. Stay in the bottle, sorry. Those bubbles just used to escape because at the time they didn't have a standardized bottle, and they used cloth to as a stopper in the bottle. They didn't have corks. So what happened during the 1600s that started helping them capture the effervescence and create champagne was they had bottles that had a uniform neck opening. They started using corks as a seal, and the English developed a method for making very strong glass, which was important so that these bottles weren't exploding with the strength of the bubbles inside them. A standard bottle of champagne now has it's the equivalent of 3 car tires of pressure inside it, 6 atmospheres of pressure inside a bottle. So if the glass isn't strong enough, it's just going to explode. And in fact, at some point they were losing say 80% of bottles were getting smashed or just exploding because of they couldn't withstand the pressure inside. So because of these things that were invented during the 1600s, they were starting to understand fermentation a little bit better. They were able to control the fermentation a little bit better, and having the wines in bottles meant that they could ship the wine in the bottles and store it easier than in these big cumbersome casks that they used to use. And also by the end of the 17th century, the end of the 1600s, and the term vin de champagne was in common usage. So it was starting to get recognized as its own region, and it had something very different. The first intentionally produced sparkling wine from Champagne was made from 1695 to 1698. So that's all quite interesting. So then moving on to the 1700s, fermentation still wasn't quite controlled. They still had a lot to learn from science, and there was a lot of trial and error going on, and there was still a lot of breakages. But in 1735, there was a royal decree. So the king at the time decided that they had to have an official champagne-sized bottle, and that had to have a specific weight. And that was 709 grams, and it had to hold a pint. At the time, the sparkling champagne was very cloudy from the sediment that was left in the bottles from the yeast and the sugar creating the bubbles. So it wasn't very nice to drink. It was pleasant in that it had bubbles. It was very sweet, but it didn't look good. So they used to serve it in opaque vessels so that you couldn't see the imperfections. So it was a very, very different wine than we drink these days. During the 1700s also, the early 1700s, Reims was very famous for textiles. So there were wealthy textile barons that had their textile houses and shops, and they would gift their customers with cases of sparkling wine. And they found that the customers were coming back to get textiles, but also to get another gift of the sparkling wine. So the very wealthy textile barons started developing their own champagne houses. So we had in 1729, the first one was Ruinart. Then in 1743, Moet et Chandon. In 1760, we had Delamont and Lanson. In 1772, Veuve Clicquot. 1776, Roederer. And 1785, we had Heidsieck. So all the time during the 1700s was really when it started to build its reputation, and these champagne houses and everything were becoming available. And then by the time of 1789, the French Revolution, there were 50,000 hectares in Champagne that were under vine. So if we think about it now, we've only got 34,000 hectares now. So it was a bigger area under vine in 1789. And the biggest landowners at the time were the church and nobility. They had a production of about 300,000 bottles by the end of the century. So revolution, even though royalty was obliterated, I guess, in France at the time, the champagne industry still kept going. But then the 1800s meant that there were more wars. They had the Napoleonic Wars with Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And yet again, the champagne cellars were raided. So it just seems like every generation, there's a war, and there's something that the Champagne people had to get over, but they had a way of just dealing with it. So after the Napoleonic Wars, the Champenois saw a positive side to it, if you could say that, thinking that if the soldiers took the champagne home with them, because they were just depleting all the cellars, they'd raid these champagne cellars and take everything with them. And the Champenois thought, well, it couldn't be too bad, because if they take it back to their home countries and people would rave about it and discover their lovely wines, then it would boost their foreign market in times of peace. So that was the way they justified losing a lot of their champagne at the time. So also in the 1800s, after the Napoleon War, during and after, there were a lot more German immigrants, and as a result, there are a lot of more houses of champagne. So in 1811, the champagne, and a lot of them had German origins, so the Germans coming to Champagne and starting their old champagne houses. In 1811, Perrier-Jouet. 1825, we have Billecart Salmon, Joseph Perrier. 1827, Mumm was German. 1829, Renaudin Bollinger. They said Bollinger at the time. They were German. 1838, Deutz. 1843, Krug. And 1853, Paul Roger. So by 1820, they had increased the number of champagne houses from the 10 that they had in the late 1700s at the time of the French Revolution to about 100 different champagne houses. So it was quite a time of advancement and bringing the industry up. And they had a lot, and 1800s is when they had a lot of understanding changed with production. So they learned how much sugar to add and yeast to control fermentation. And another big exciting thing that happened in 1818, Veuve Clicquot, Madame Clicquot, created what she called at the time a horizontal sediment collection table. So she got her cellar master to drill some holes in a table, in her kitchen table, legend has it, that they could turn the bottles upside down so that all the sediment that was left as a result of the yeast and sugars interacting to make the carbon dioxide that causes the bubbles in the bottle, that was all settled on the bottom, and that's what caused the champagne to be cloudy. If they could get it up into the neck of the bottle and get it out somehow, then the wine was much clearer. So that was really interesting. Madame Clicquot, like many women in the area, had to take over these businesses when the husbands either died from diseases that we didn't have, that we don't have these days, or went off to war and died. So women actually had a very, and this is a whole other lecture to talk about, I think, the role of women in champagne, but people like the Veuve Clicquot creating the start of riddling, clarifying the wine. We also have Madame Pommery, who was also a young widow who invented brut champagne. She realized that there was a market for a less sweet champagne and really reduced the amount of sugar for her the English market, which was quite big, and she noticed that the English people appreciated the champagne a little bit more drier, and she invented brut champagne. Madame Bollinger, very significant during World War II as well, and the way she dealt with the Germans at the time trying to take over her house. So there's quite a few advancements. Also during World War I, the women had to work the fields because the men had all gone off to war, and they made some changes in how the vines were tended. They used to be what they called en foule, on some vertical posts, and it was backbreaking work to trim them and everything. And the women during the war decided if they put them along the trellises, along the wires, it was a lot easier to to maintain. So there's been a lot of interesting work done by women in Champagne, more by fate that's put them in that position rather than and by necessity. So it's something else that I think is worth looking into if anybody's. There's a very good book called The Widow Clicquot that talks about her and how she got on and did it. So she, 1818 she invented her little riddling rack, the start of it, and then it was in 1840 that her A-shaped pupitre, and I had a photo of the pupitre, I think most people have seen that, on the left-hand side of the picture, which is where they had the bottles that they'd go in horizontally when the fermentation had finished, the second fermentation had finished, and it takes the riddler about 6 weeks. They get turned a quarter of a turn and then tipped up a couple of degrees each day for about 6 weeks. They'll go one turn one way, one turn another way, and tip them up. It takes about 6 weeks to do that process, and a good riddler would be down in the cellars, could turn about 50,000 bottles a day by hand. It's quite fascinating to see them do that. So you can see that clarifying the wine, taking all of those blemishes out, really made a big difference to what we enjoyed as a drink. So just when they were starting to make some progress and get things going well, unfortunately in 1888, so towards the end of the 1800s, phylloxera, which is a terrible bug that came in and destroyed the roots of the vines, killed off pretty much all of the vines in Champagne, except for a few little walled gardens that were protected, and there's only 2 of those left at Bollinger now. And they have some very special Champagne, and they're trying to preserve that history there. But the phylloxera was a horrible, horrible thing, really gave a big hit to the industry. And then on top of that, after that, they realized that the growers realized they needed to form a kind of a union to try and get together and work out what they were going to do. They had already 28.5 million bottles in the early 1900s that were getting produced each year. And then they had electricity that came along that helped a lot with the mechanization of things. And then they decided, as I said, they'd form their union and start protecting their brand, because they realized that they had something that was special and was different to what other people had. So 1904, they formed their union. 1905, they put in a law that regulated the brand. So they tried to protect their own brand and say that you couldn't call, or they tried to say that other people couldn't call anything Champagne unless it came from Champagne. They also tried to protect the quality of the grapes. So they introduced in 1911 something that was called the échelle de cru. Now, that was a way of regulating or saying that to different village, different vines that had different slopes or drainage or sunshine coming to them were better than others. So you have the Grand Cru, the Premier Cru, and then the ordinary Champagne vines were all regulated a little way. So that was 1911. And also in 1911, they passed a law that said Champagne must appear on the labels, on corks, and on their packaging. So already more than 100 years ago, they were trying to protect it and make sure that their wine stood out and was different from others. So we have our riddling racks. And then, unfortunately, another war, the First World War, and there was the big Battle of the Marne. And so that was when most of the work was done in the fields by the women, and the economy became very depressed. So in the 20s, after the First World War, they had to replant all of the vineyards. And so they had an association called the Association Viticole Champagne, the AVC, and that was formed to make sure that everybody followed best practice. And they also developed a public relations committee back then as well. They also decided that the Orbe could finally, the Orbe area, which was down the bottom, down near Burgundy, finally became included in the whole Champagne viticole, because before that, back in 1911, when they made the échelle de cru, they decided that the Orbe was only what they called a deuxième zone appellation, so caused a lot of angst between the growers that were down there and the people up closer to Ranson-Epernay, because they felt that they were second class and they didn't think they should be. So in the 1920s, I think it was 1927, they passed a law that said that the orb was actually part of Champagne. So everybody was a little bit happier. I think they needed something after the war. But then, unfortunately, as we know, there was the Great Depression, which didn't help anything again. And they, at that time, they founded their first, I think it was 1925, their first interprofessional organisation to try and unite the growers and the houses. Unfortunately, again, so yes, but in the Great Depression, you can see the number of growers, I've got that there in the slide, drops from 25,000 growers to only 13,300 growers, but then they had a surplus of grapes. So that in the industry, they started developing cooperatives where growers got together to put all of their grapes together so that they could produce together, grow together to make a label or a label, bottle it under a cooperative's label. And in 1936, it was 100% mechanised, the bottle production and everything. 1937, Martin and Chandon were the first to produce their prestige cuvée, which was named in honour of the great Dom Perignon. So that's when the legend of Dom Perignon creating champagne or inventing champagne started, with Martin Chandon trying to publicise that. So, you know, lots happening in the 30s. And then sadly, we get World War II. And it just seems like every time, as I said before, every time they got to some point, there was another war that came along and held everything up. So in World War II, Reims was levelled again. The industry had to start all over again, but they did have mechanisation to help them. So the crayères became important again, that they were hiding resistance fighters, and a lot of the houses were able to hide a lot of their champagnes this time. They built false walls in there so that the Germans couldn't find them. During that time, they also, I think it was the end, about 1945, the CIVC, which is still now the Comité Interprofessionnel de Vin de Champagne, or Champagne Bureau, was formed. They just had to be united to try and get over everything and keep their industry going. So that was the 40s. So at the end of World War II, they were producing about 40 million bottles of champagne still. So the production's going up. And by the 1950s, mid-1950s, they were up to about 46 million bottles. So what had changed between the 40s and the 50s was they had more farm equipment replacing horses and the labour force, so they could get some things done. Wooden shipping crates replaced cardboard. And the fermentation was temperature controlled, which helped them regulate what was happening, and it helped a lot with the quality of the champagne that was being produced. So 46 million bottles at the end of the 1950s. By the time we got to the 1960s, many of the houses had taken over the lead of Martin and Chandon, or producing their own special and prestige cuvées. So it just became another marketing thing for them, where there was something just a little bit better. So a prestige cuvée would be something that was really showing off their house style, or not just their normal non-vintage where they could blend different years. It was something that they really wanted to show the talent of their cellar master. They also, at that time, switched from only using oak barrels to using stainless steel vats for fermentation. So some people choose to still use oak barrels because there's a certain quality that gives to the champagne that they choose to use. But when they're trying to make high volume, it was much more easier to manage using the larger fermentation, stainless steel fermentation vats. And at the time in the 1960s, 3/4 of all champagne that was produced was consumed in France. So only 1/4 of it was going overseas. So that brings us through to the 1970s, which doesn't seem that long ago, but it's still 50 years ago in a very rich history. And in the 1970s, the biggest thing probably that happened was the Jira pallets were developed. Now, Jira pallets is like a metal cage that holds a lot of bottles that's mechanized and spins to do the work of hand riddling. And it works, they can be programmed, and they turn every 6 hours and do sort of replicate what the riddler was doing. But because they can work day and night, it only takes about 5-6 days to do the riddling process that takes 6 weeks by hand. So it just meant that they could get a lot more bottles produced and out into the market. So in 1970, at the beginning of the 1970s, there was 175 million bottles produced. And by 1979, there was 217 million. So it's quite a considerable increase. And by that stage, 2/3 of the champagne produced was consumed in France. So you can see that the foreign market really started to grow between the 1960s and the 1970s. The foreign market is taking a little bit more market share by then. So that continued through the 80s, and there's the excesses of the 80s, and I think was a really good thing for champagne. People wanted to drink it. It was more accessible in overseas countries. And by 1990, there was 286 million bottles being produced of champagne in the world. But then what was really interesting in 1996 was the Madrid Protocol went into effect. Now, the Madrid Protocol is an international treaty designed to simplify international trademark registration. And it's what they use, I've just written in the slide there, it protects a geographical name or any reference donating an appellation d'origine. So that's the AOC we see on champagne, but there's many other products. It's not just for champagne, but it goes through, I can't remember how many countries, I think there's about 90 countries in the world that are in the Madrid agreement there. So that was really helpful to champagne to turn around and say to other countries, you can't put champagne on your bottles. So some countries, they managed to have an agreement with them that they would call it champagne style or champagne method, but they were only allowed to use that until a certain amount of time, I think about the mid-2000s, where they had to swap. They weren't allowed to say méthode champenoise anymore. They had to say méthode traditionnelle to indicate that it was made the same way as champagne. So they really made sure that there wasn't any reference at all to that champagne method. And in 80s, the 90s, that's when they took Christian Dior to court because he had his perfume called Champagne, and they won. So he had to rename that, which I think was a shame. He renamed it Ivresse, which means drunkenness in French. So it was a bit sad because it was quite a classy perfume. So but that Madrid Protocol going into effect made a really big difference to help champagne protect their brand. So by the time we got to 2000, which really the glory days of champagne, they were producing 331 million bottles a year, which is probably about getting to the peak of where they were. And then that brings us up to the next significant thing that happened, where I started the talk, was the the UNESCO World Heritage listing on July the 4th, 2015, which has just celebrated its 5th birthday. So bringing us back to 2019, and you can see from the slide that we've only got almost 2 million bottles produced. So the production's gone down a little bit since 2000. Some of that is because some of the other sparkling wines are becoming popular with the younger generation. So namely Prosecco, which is cheaper and seems a bit trendier. So Champagne's really trying hard to get their market share back again. It will happen. I don't think Champagne will ever disappear. It's got all this rich history. It's such a special drink to drink, and nothing else is quite like champagne. So I hope some of that was interesting parts of champagne that you hadn't heard of. I do find it's a little bit hard to talk about a whole 2,000 years of history almost in 45 minutes, but it is good to know that when they say that champagne is not like anything else, it really isn't. So I don't know, are there any questions?
Yeah, yes, they are, Amanda. I'm coming back on board here. Please feel free to ask any questions in the chat. And I have to admit that if you keep on asking questions about what we're having with the champagne, I'm going to turn off that chat, because Stefan is saying, no, it started with, it's interesting. Miranda is saying, we're having champagne and cooking French mussels in white wine to celebrate and complement the lesson. So it was really good. Adrienne said French mussels, yeah, brings back the memories. And Stefan saying we're from Southwest, so we're cooking cassoulet to have with our champers. And then I have Janine sending me a picture of her charcuterie platters. So what is your recommendation? It's probably a personal question, but what is champagne good to pair with?
So it is something that I'm going to turn off. How about I stop the slide presentation? I forgot there was that button. It depends which champagne you're having. So, there's so many different styles of champagne, and they all have a different flavor profile. So, for example, if you're having something that's got more Chardonnay in it, Chardonnay has a lot more citrus flavors. It's a lot sharper, and like a Blanc de Blanc is 100% Chardonnay, but some of them have a lot more Chardonnay in the blend mixed with the other grapes. That's beautiful with something like oysters, seafood, lighter flavored things, and even rich foods, because the acidity from the Chardonnay cuts through. So chips. So I think who was having more frit there, if they had a Blanc de Blanc, it would have been
fries.
Fries, yeah. I think Blanc de Blanc would be really good with that. The cassoulet is quite rich. It probably needs something. It's got the sausages in it. It's quite flavoursome. It would probably need something that had a bit more structure. So something with a bit more Pinot Noir in it, or a Blanc de Noir, which goes really well, or even a rosé. So the rosé champagnes have a lot more complex. That's something that's become a lot more drunk lately and a lot more in demand of rosés. It's the fastest growing sector in champagne. So rosé is very, very versatile, and it goes well with the stronger flavors as well. So you can have rosé from entree with something like salmon for your entree, or langoustine, something like that. You can have it with duck for your main, and you can have it with your dessert. So rosé is a good one if you're not really sure what you're having. So yeah, it depends on the richness of what you're having and the flavors, but it's always better that they work well together rather than competing with each other.
There's a lot of compliments coming through in the chat. I will let you go through them. It was a very interesting presentation, amazing history. Thank you. I don't know if we can get the poll to work, but I'd like to know if we can ask a question to the people who are listening. We've got 68 people who've just come up, and I'd like to know if you've been celebrating Bastille Day with champagne, as we do with Amanda today, if that's something you actually do. So I do have a question that was, there's been a lot of questions from Catherine. Has the World Heritage listing be a bit of a double-edged sword, do you think? Houses, cellars, renovations, etc., now more difficult and expensive for the buyers and the owners? What do you think about that?
There was some discussion about that at the time, the people that were not 100% sure of it, but they think, from what I can understand from when I talk to the Champagne people about it, they're just happy to have it because it brings tourism in, and the extra tourism that they get and the extra people that are visiting their houses more than pays for what they have to do. But what they have started doing is, when you went to Champagne back in the 90s, well, I started going to Champagne in about 1995, so quite a long time. I've seen a lot of change in the region in that time. If you went to visit, it was hard to go to the houses. You had to have some introduction. They weren't open to the public, so now they're open to the public. And the growers, you could just drive up to their cellar door. They'd have little signs out that said degustation, go in, and they'd open a bottle and they'd say, oh, you can't go yet because the bottle's not finished. And they'd open another bottle, and everything was free. They were very, very, very generous with what they gave you. But now most people charge for tastings. The houses, more and more houses are open to the public, but they're quite expensive to visit. and this is the way they're, and this has only happened in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and this is how they're also realising if people are going to come to visit and they're going to have to keep their premises up to scratch and everything, people are going to have to pay. And I think that's fair enough. I don't have a problem with paying to visit. It's just like going to any other heritage place. If you go to a museum, you have to pay, you know.
Yeah. If you, on the right-hand side, there are all these questions coming through, which I will ask. But in the polls, we do have people who have started answering. So we're still winning, Amanda, with the 53% of people drinking a glass of champagne.
Oh, well, if you're not drinking, you have to go and get some. I think another thing that's been interesting, particularly in the last 5 years in Australia, I've noticed there's a lot more variety of champagne available in some of the bigger bottle shops. It's a lot more accessible. Yeah. There's probably less, sadly, there is less grower champagne available because it's just the education that's required to teach people about these different grower champagnes and trying to compete against some of the more well-known names. It's very difficult. So it's been hard for the people trying to import the growers. But there are some grower champagnes out there if you look, often online, and in specialty liquor stores, not the big ones, but still the range that is available in some of the bigger mass market places is good. It's a lot better than it used to be.
Okay, Seb, who's been working on the questions, Debbie's saying the question was a flute of champagne should be consumed from a tulip glass.
Well, this is, I think, Betty, we've both got the tulip flute. It's still called a tulip flute.
Yeah. That's what it is.
The glass. So I've got, actually, I bought this. I didn't know if the question would come up, but it often comes up about the little coupe.
Oh, that my grandmother's.
Yeah. That are supposed to come from Marie Antoinette. Some people say Madame de Pompadour. I don't know. I think Madame de Pompadour was a little bit before Marie Antoinette. They're very elegant. They're good for a party. They're good for sorbet, but there's no room for your bubbles to rise up. In the tulip, in a flute, a normal flute, it's very straight up and down. So it's great for the bubbles rising up, but there's nowhere for it to develop. But in your tulip flute, with the shape here, the bubbles have room to open up, so the aromas can open up, and then it concentrates it back to your nose here. So everything opens up. The flavors are all there, and it's interesting if you can get your hands on some of these, and then try the same bottle of champagne, the same in a standard flute, because everybody has those up and down flutes, and then try it in something like that. Yeah. Or even if you don't have these tulip flutes, if you try them in a white wine glass, it just has a wider bowl, you'll see what I mean. So suddenly you can start to sense some of the different smells in there that you couldn't, and you appreciate it better, and it warms up a little bit more quickly, and it needs to be a little bit warmer for you to be able to appreciate the different aromas that are in there as well. So it's a good exercise to do at home. If you if you do at home with your bottle of champagne, go and get a white wine glass and see if you can tell the difference.
If you do want to do some tasting, Amanda is doing masterclasses, and she probably will be doing one masterclass with us in October when the festival will be back on. So it's interesting to see, because when you taste them, as you said, you can taste them in different types of glasses and flutes, but also the taste of the champagne. When I did the Roederer visit, they actually let the champagne sit for a while, and you smell it and you taste it, and it just changes. So after about half an hour, you go back to something that has a different taste. So it's very interesting to play with them.
And I know that so it was about 5 or 6 years I've been doing the master classes at the festival for you, and we have all the glasses poured out beforehand, and everybody comes in and you can tell they just want to drink the champagne, and say, well, it's getting warm, and I said, yes, but you're going to taste, and they realize you can taste their flavors. There's different ways. I'm not saying that you have to let the champagne warm up every time. There's a time and a place. If you're trying a new champagne and you really want to be able to understand the complexity, or try and have a think about what grapes might be in there, because this is the sort of thing I can teach you in the master classes, the different characteristics of the different grapes. But sometimes you just want to have a glass of champagne with your friends or your husband or your partner, and you don't want to think about it. You just want to enjoy it, and then put it in whatever glass you want to and have it nice and cold and just enjoy the moment. You don't have to analyze it every time. But if you are trying to analyze it, or particularly if you're really trying to do a good food match, it is good to try and put it in a bigger glass. And a lot of the big restaurants in France now, that when you have champagne with the meal, they always serve it in a white wine glass, just so that it opens up those characteristics, and you drink it more like a wine and when you're having it with food.
Yeah. We're here to talk about culture, history, but Kate is asking an interesting question. I'm off to buy some new flutes tomorrow. Am I correct in saying that those flutes you recommend, you can find them on the Truffleman website?
Yes, you can.
Okay, here you go. That's the answer question, Kate. You can go to the Truffleman and all those glasses are available, the ones that Amanda is drinking from.
Yeah.
We do have a question. The volume of wine produced today compared with 200 years ago has significantly increased, probably given the number of hectares on the vine has reduced. Is it purely due to advances in viticulture, or is there a limit on the total number of bottles of champagne that can be produced given the size of land on the vine?
Okay, so that's a really interesting question, Anita. So each year, this is the role of the CIVC, the Champagne Bureau. They control the amount of juice they're allowed to press. So some years, each hectare, they're allowed to get 10,000 litres. Last year, they were only allowed to press 8,000 litres per hectare of vine. So they're using that restriction in the amount of juice that they can produce to control the market a little bit. So nothing is wasted in champagne. So those extras, so they'll get their 8,000, say their 8,000 litres per hectare that they were allowed to last year. They'll make that wine, they'll make that champagne from that. Then they're allowed to keep a little bit extra. I think it's the equivalent of 1 year's harvest in reserve. So they might decide that was a brilliant harvest, and they'll get rid of all of their 1 year of reserve wine, and they'll keep everything from 2017 or 2018 and get rid of the rest they had. Or they might decide, oh, I like 2013, I'll keep a little bit, but they're only allowed in total to have 1 year of reserve wine, and that's what they use in the blend. But it's also as an insurance policy for a bad harvest, or when they have hail that destroys the crop, that at least they'll be able to make some champagne in 1 year if they've got none that they can harvest themselves.
Okay.
So the limit is set by the Champagne Bureau each year. They didn't used to do that years and years and years ago. That would be something that started in the 1950s.
Okay. Quickly, what was the book you mentioned in your lesson about women in Champagne? Was it Widowing?
It's called The Widow. That's just specifically about Veuve Clicquot, but it applies to a lot of women. It's just a really interesting read. It's called The Widow Clicquot.
The Widow Clicquot. And
yeah.
And then we've got a question from Natalie. Sorry, Amanda. Natalie saying, my family lives in Troyes in Champagne, Galore. They drink champagne all the time. Yes, they do, from morning to night. That's the only drink they drink. Yeah. Which one would you recommend for people who want to try it for the first time? So please feel free to mention any names. You're not committed to all the producers can just go, oh, we just want to know. It's a really good question. If my daughter wants to try champagne, which one should I really open for someone who doesn't know anything about champagne?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And so this is not an endorsement. And as Betty said, I'm an independent ambassador. I like to talk about everything, but I also know that there are cost restrictions for some people as well. Yeah. What I would suggest, because there are different, I think you need to probably, for your daughter, Betty, let's say that she's young, she's starting to learn about champagne. You want them to like it, but they're not going to have the developed palate that's worth giving them an expensive champagne. But if you give them a really cheap one, and that's a whole different story about some of the $25 champagnes that you can get, they're going to be astringent and not nice. So it's got to be something that's reasonably well made, even if it's mass produced. So something, it's still worth spending about $45, $50 on. And there are some good ones out there. You can get Mumm depending if you watch the sales, you can get Mode and Chandon. Veuve Clicquot, now there's different, there seems to be Team Veuve Clicquot and Team Mode and Chandon. A lot of the Team Veuve Clicquot, there's a taste thing. Mode and Chandon is much more elegant and Chardonnay driven than the Veuve Clicquot is a lot more Pinot driven, and there's a lot more reserve wine back vintages in it. So it's got a lot more depth, but women love Veuve Clicquot because of the marketing around it. They love the color. It looks like, they're not really thinking about what it tastes like, but it seems to be very popular. It might be a little bit rich for someone to try as their first one. Mum is elegant. It's light as well. It's not going to, and you can get that for a reasonable price. Piper Heidsieck. What else is around that's not? But once you start getting up to a champagne, like one of my personal favorites is Bollinger. It's very very Pinot Noir. It's very rich. It's a very almost a masculine champagne. And if you don't have the palate for it, you're not going to really appreciate it. And it's not worth spending $80 on a bottle for somebody who doesn't know what they're drinking and what goes into it. Perrier-Jouet is one I love also. Again, it's that next price range up, and they might not appreciate the true elegance of it if they hadn't tried something else. So I would say stick within that 45 to 55 price range if they can, and a non-vintage champagne from a recognised house. As a starter.
I have to say that when I started drinking champagne, I didn't like the very aggressive big bubbles. So to me, the first one I could drink were the ones with little fitsy bubbles. So it is definitely worth paying a bit more to try a good one.
Aggressive bubbles come from, so there's rules when they're making the non-vintage champagne. It has to stay 18 months in the cellars after they've disgorged it and put the cork in, and it lies in the cellars for 18 months for the just to rest. And the longer it stays in the cellars, the smaller those bubbles become. It's just part of the aging process. So people that are trying to go through high volume and get a lot out and get a quick return for their money, they'll get it out after 18 months. They'll package it up, they'll disgorge it, they'll package it up, and they'll get it out to the store. There has to be 2 months after it's been disgorged and labelled before they can sell it in shops. So they'll get it out and turn it over as quickly as they can. And they're the ones with the bigger bubbles, and they're usually the cheaper ones that have usually been made from second press grapes, not the really good stuff that comes. So it's often a good question to ask, or to see if it's written, some of the bottles have that detail on, is how much time it's spent on lease. So if it's a non-vintage champagne and it said it spent 3 years on lease, it's already twice what it has to be called a non-vintage champagne. In fact, that's as long as a vintage champagne needs to be left on lease. So their time on lease, if it's written on the bottle, is a really good indication of how well it's been made, because if they've taken the time to leave it double the length of time, they're not in a hurry to sell it. What they're trying to do is make a good champagne, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Amanda. I think we've gone through as much as we could on being virtual. I'm really looking forward to doing a real masterclass where we can taste it, we can savor it, we can drink it, smell it. But I think it's wonderful that we've gone back to the basics and go through the whole history. I think we all learned many things that we didn't know. Thank you for all your messages. I've got one from Roy and Arietta. Coming back from celebrating Bastille Day at Gibong RSL with members of the French Association of Australia and the veterans of the French Armed Forces. So we do have Jane who left a message from Melbourne. There are people from everywhere listening to us tonight. That's the beauty of the internet.
Yeah.
We should have been in Musgrave Park all together to celebrate Bastille Day in July.
Yeah.
But we have decided to postpone the event due to the current situation, and I think that was a very wise move.
Yeah.
So we will definitely see you all. I've got here the dates. Okay, I'm going to put that in. So we will see you all on the 16th, 17th, and 18th of October in Musgrave Park. So we've already started organizing masterclasses, conferences, and we hope we will see you all there. Meanwhile, I hope you enjoy whatever is left of Bastille Day. We have just checked the weather forecast, and it seems to be sunny weather in Paris, where we will be live streaming in an hour with Caroline and Lisa. right from the cafe floor. So it's going to be interesting because they're right in the middle of summer. We are right in the middle of winter, and we've got the exact same temperature. And they think it's beautiful. So we will definitely go there on the terrace to see how everything is going in France. This is a free webinar. But if you enjoyed it and if you want us to keep on working on cultural conferences and masterclasses and make sure the festival survive this really tough year for events, any event organizer will tell you the same thing. You're more than welcome to help us by making a small donation. So all the information is on the right-hand side. Thank you very much, everyone, for staying that long with us, and enjoy your glass of champagne and happy Bastille Day. Cheers, Amanda.
Cheers, everyone. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Au revoir.